Hi, my name is Janice Switlo. Today I want to touch briefly upon surrenders, the kinds of surrenders, how it can happen, and the distinctions between the use of the word, for instance, in treaties and the use of the word in Indian Act, for instance. So let's be clear that in treaties, for example, treaties 1 to 11, the word surrender is not pertaining to a sale of land, because in those treaties are the operational words to have and to hold, which indicate an estate only in the lands are being granted under that treaty. So it's not a sale. It's not a surrender seed, etc. Why are those words in there then? Because what it's doing is promising to the Crown, saying in writing, look, any other deals I might have had with anyone else that came before you, my previous tenants, they're done. I surrender them. This allows the Crown to step in as the head tenant and doesn't have to worry about another country coming along and saying, hey, wait a minute, we had a deal 200 years ago. Our treaty came first, so you're beneath us. So that's what you'll see in treaties 1 to 11, for example, that surrender. And again, I'll get into some really specific legal discussion on the to have and to hold provisions at a later date. So now you have the fact that under treaties, for example, there are reservations. What that means is we agree to this, but there are some exceptions. In the case of, for example, treaties 1 to 11, the reservations are not clauses, they are actually parts of land. So these areas do not form part of the treaty. They remain within our sole jurisdiction. There's some agreement to have some administration happen, things like that. But the fact is that Crown partial political sovereignty does not extend to the reservations, or in Canada they're called reserves. Now, in terms of dealing with lands, Her Majesty set out and bound herself, the Crown binds itself, to how to deal with Indigenous nations and their people. How can the Crown secure an interest that is certain, for example? So there is a requirement under, for instance, Royal Proclamation 1763. Here's how to approach it. Here's what we need to do, right? So today you have provisions in the Indian Act that say, talk about surrenders. There's a number of different surrenders. So for example, there's an absolute surrender. That's actually a sale of reserve lands. So now you're actually giving up and selling off that part of those lands which you kept out of granting permissions to the Crown to exercise there. Then you have something called surrender by way of designation. Now this is again where you're handing authority, because you're gonna lease this and it's going to be administered by the Crown, and this type of surrender by way of designation. We have some more surrender types. In that is we have surrender by way of First Nation Land Management Act, land code, because of opting into that regime, which basically hands over authority to Chief and Council to then deal with the lands, because it's a whole surrender of the entire reserves. And sometimes there's reserves exempted. I haven't seen that example happen yet, but anyhow, it's a full surrender. So you don't have to go back to the Crown each time to present a viable project for use of the banned lands. Remember, it's a collective interest. The Crown no longer has a fiduciary duty to inspect and make sure that benefits go to the people as a whole and not into the hands and pockets of individuals like a chief and council. So you have a number of ways, and now of course we have something a little different, which is the framework agreements, the framework process. And that's just being signed off by chief. And there's no voting, because the whole issue here is about getting evidence that the people as a whole have agreed to this, because after all, they hold the collective interest. Remember, there was no one king or queen in this part of the world. That made it difficult for the Crown to come here, because there was no counterpart to do a deal. It couldn't just sign one treaty and it's all done. It covers this whole area. Trying to deal with that, the Crown, who should I deal with? How do I get permissions? Who do I have to get the permissions from? Started moving across, and that's why you have the numbered treaties, for example, because this area is where she approached and said, okay, can you tell me who I should deal with? Show me your authorized people because I want to do a deal. I want to get permissions from them. And so they presented their people and they signed. Each of these treaties, for example, though, these are boundaries for the Crown, not boundaries for the Indigenous nationals, because their territory is a lot bigger. Their country is a lot bigger than any one treaty. Remember, the treaties didn't create them. They, as a nation, entered into treaties, right? So their nations have a number of treaties. And all of those things can be surrendered and given up. This is how the Canadian courts, Canadian governments are doing this by mere representation to say, oh, we never really were nations, we never really could have done that, we didn't have these things, and this is all that framework process. And yes, we always have been part of Canada, and even though the courts, if you're watching my episodes in order, I've just spoken about how courts just say certain things, and common law means this, and so they realize that a Canadian court just saying that really isn't going to give effect to that. So they need something from the people, and they know they're not going to get that from the people because the people are too informed, and they're not going to go for that. Every time they've tried to get a surrender, a giving up of sovereignty, a giving up of ownership of lands, it's failed. And I am happy to kind of report that it's because a lot of my information that I've given to grassroots, if you will, and elders and hereditary chiefs and clansmothers and things of that, people of that nature, that they haven't voted for something. And that's great. I'm happy that I've been able to contribute that way. But now they're saying, okay, well, we still can't get it. We really need it. We're going to put in place a process whereby, okay, it looks like the only thing there is the AFN. It's got, they really don't have any governance. The only thing they really have is this lobby group. And so, we can just consult with the national chief there, and that'll be good. And we'll consult with these other national organizations. And that's all we need to do. And now with the framework process, these agreements being signed by chiefs because, they carry the authorities because, we got them to pass these election codes and these membership codes and these constitutions, and buried within all the gobbledygook that in poorly written language are actually some clear statements that purports to be handing over their authority to these individuals, which are, by the way, a federal board, an Indian Act federal board. Again, this is not going to work. How many billions of dollars is Canada going to spend trying to steal what's not theirs? Wouldn't it make more sense to stop trying to manufacture surrender, stop trying to degrade the level necessary for a positive vote? When the Harper government changed the status from 50% plus one to 25%, all these different things, and I intend to take that on. Canada cannot undermine the requirements that the Crown must meet, must be satisfied or met just because legislation is passed. The fact remains the people need to decide. The people need to evidence that decision, and certain numbers and percentages at the very minimum are necessary under Her Majesty's law. Now let's also not forget, it has to be, in order to be binding, has to comply with Indigenous law. First of all, can they even do those things that are requested? Most times not. Secondly, how is decision making done? Now, there's a lot of rediscovery happening because there's been so much interference, and then being told, this is how you do it. And it's tried to say an oppressor cannot dictate how things are done unless, you're really, in effect, engaging in war and threats against the peace. And I remind, and this is again why Canada is an outlaw nation, it is not complying with its restraints that are in place because of that very important, very critical, foundational relationship that exists between the Indigenous nations and the Crown. It can't be ignored. So why don't we start putting our efforts in instead of trying to say, making up ridiculous law that says, they somehow got absorbed and we'll pass this law and they don't really have to decide. They can hand it over, and all these different manipulations and manufacturing of attempting to manufacture that they're gone. You know, domestic ethnic Maoris, we own it all. We can push them aside as long as we do these things. These are human beings. These are nations. They're the longest standing nation. Canada's what, 154 years old coming up? They've been here a lot longer. And it's time that we start making informed, educated, and responsible decisions about how to improve and polish off this relationship that is so critical to our economic well-being and our very humanity. I hate to sound so dramatic, but for Canada to be building upon concepts that Indigenous nationals are not fully human, therefore they can be treated and dealt with like this just because they don't know or because their lawyers have not been exposed to the actual Indigenous law, the existence. I have. I'm not even an Indigenous person. If I, as an academic, can view and observe the activities of nations and understand, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Don't ask me to accept that it's okay what we're doing in terms of law in Canada the last since 1982. Thank you for your time.